Hi, and welcome to another edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus. In this video, I'm going to be going over the features, controls, and how to use Nikon's FE2 compact 35mm single lens reflex camera. This camera was introduced in 1983. It's nice compact body weighing 19 ounces or 550 grams. So let's start where I always start when doing these types of videos, on the top right side of the camera. Okay, starting from just right of the prism, we have the shutter speed dial. Okay, and the shutter speeds go from 8 seconds all the way up to 1/4000th of a second. And you'll notice the 2/50th of a second is in red. That is the highest sync speed with electronic flash. But there is also an M250 setting. That is a speed that will work without batteries. Okay, this camera requires batteries not only for the meter, but for the electronic shutter. So if your batteries are dead or you don't have a battery, you can only use the M250 shutter speed. Also, even if you have batteries in the camera, the meter does not work when it's set to M250. You also have a B setting for bulb that allows you to take time exposures as long as you have your pressure on the shutter release. As long as once you press the shutter release, if you don't let go, the shutter will stay open until you release your finger. If you're using that feature, you should really have a locking cable release. Okay, now let's go around here to the A setting. Okay, the A setting is aperture priority automatic. You select the aperture on the lens, the camera selects the shutter speed, and it indicates that shutter speed in the viewfinder with a needle. It will point to the shutter speed that the camera selected. That shutter speed that the camera selects could be anywhere in between the marked speeds. However, if you are using this camera on manual, okay, on manual exposure control, you cannot set shutter speeds in between the mark speeds. Okay, that's important. Now, once you're in A, you cannot turn the shutter speed dial unless you press the center button. Okay, so for now we're just going to leave it at 2/50th of a second. Also on the top right we have the film plane indication right here, which is used in some types of close-up photography. Okay, so to the right of the shutter speed dial is the film advance lever, which has a 30-degree standoff position, and it also advances the film, cocks the shutter, and advances the frame counter. It's a single stroke. Okay, you can't use smaller strokes. One other thing, when the advance lever is in the standoff position, as we see here, the shutter release can be pressed. Let's cock the shutter. Okay, I'm going to press it in. It locks the shutter release. So when the film advance lever is flush with the body, as we see here, the shutter release is locked. Okay, there's one other thing on the advance lever I want to show you. This little black lever here, if you just pull it back a little bit and then cock the shutter, what happens is it cocks the shutter without advancing the film. So you use that for multiple exposures. So here, let me just explain better. Okay, so we take our first exposure. Now we want to take the double exposure. So we just pull this back, start to advance the lever, and what it does, it cocks the shutter but it does not advance the frame counter. Frame counter stays where it is. I'm going to show you that again. And it doesn't advance the film. So you can make multiple exposures on one frame. Okay, so now pay attention to, we're on 4 now, on frame number 4. Okay, so I'm going to, well, here we go. That was our first double exposure, let's say. So now we're going to pull this back, advance it. Okay, and you notice it's still at 4. Now we take any, the additional exposure. Okay, the frame counter is additive, and it will reset when we open the back. Oh, one other thing on the shutter release, it is threaded in the center for a standard cable release. With the older Nikon cable releases for the F and the F2 will not work with this camera. They are threaded around the collar of at the bottom of the collar of the shutter release. Okay, so why don't we go to the front of the camera now? Oh, one other thing. We're going to talk about this when I explain how to load film. But when there's no film in the camera, I'm just going to skip ahead here a little bit, open the back real quick. But don't worry about that. I'm going to show you how to do that. When we open the back, the counter advances, resets to start. Okay, and when we're in that position where it's start, before we get to frame number 1, the meter will not function, okay? And if the camera's on automatic, it will automatically set a 2/50th of a second shutter speed. Once we reach frame number 1, then the meter becomes active. Okay, so now let's go to the right front of the camera. Pretty simple. Let's advance this. Okay, we have our self-timer. It has a 10-second delay. And we just bring it down and then press the shutter release. The mirror flips up, the lens stops down to the working aperture, and then the camera will fire. Let me show you that again. Just pay attention to the lens, and you will see the lens stop down. Right now, the lens is wide open, right? We're going to do that, press the shutter release. I hope you could see this, that the lens has stopped down. I think it's set for f8. The mirror has flipped up, and the shutter releases. This is great for, if you're on a tripod, you don't have a cable release, it's a good way to get real sharp images because you don't have to worry about any vibration from the mirror. The fact that the mirror flipped up, the lens stops down, and it's just a 10-second delay. So you're going to use that for landscapes or macro photography. Obviously, you can't use that feature for action. All right, another thing on the front of the camera is this lever here. This is your depth of field preview. Okay, so I'm going to press that towards the camera. Okay, and you can see that the lens stops down to f8. As long as I hold this down, the aperture will remain at f8. You use that to observe depth of field on the focusing screen. Of course, the screen is going to go dark, especially if you're set to really small apertures, let's say, f16. And you could see how small that opening is, which lets in very little light, and the screen's going to go pretty dark. Okay, one more thing on the front here, and that's the self-timer lever. And I'll show you how the self-timer works, but this also acts as a memory lock when in auto exposure mode, when your shutter speed dial is set to A. By pressing the self-timer lever towards the lens and holding it there, it will lock in the exposure that the camera selected. Now, why would you need to use that? Quick example, let's say you're photographing some family members at the beach, your kids at the beach, and they're at the edge of the water, so the area behind them is really bright. You got sky, you got the water, and if you just stood back, took a shot, the meter's going to pick up a lot of that sky. So what you need to do is move in closer, press in. Now obviously the camera's on automatic at this point, and just hold in that self-timer lever, back up, and take the shot. So when you move in, you're going to make sure you fill a good bit of the frame with the kids and not the sky. And then you hold in that self-timer lever, press it in towards the lens, and take your picture. Okay, when you recompose. All right, continuing with the front of the camera, let's talk about the lens mount. It's a standard Nikon F bayonet mount. However, this camera will only accept AI lenses. Now let's leave it this way. It will only accept AI lenses. Now let me explain real quick why. Okay, let's remove this lens. This is a Series E lens, which are AI. When Nikon first introduced the Nikon F and all through the 60s until 1977, the lenses were what's called pre-AI. And here's an example of a pre-AI lens. You will notice the coupling prong, other than that opening in the middle, is solid. In 1977, they went to AI, which is called automatic indexing. This camera will only accept lenses with automatic indexing. One of the ways to tell is the coupling prong will have two little holes in it, as you can see here. Also, will it have a second row of aperture numbers towards the back. Also, it will take AIS lenses, which are basically the same as AI lenses, except you will notice that the smallest aperture, in this case 22, is in amber both up here and on the smaller row of aperture numbers. Series E lenses, although they do not have the coupling prong, work perfectly fine with this camera, as do autofocus lenses that have an aperture ring. They will not work with the newer G lenses, which do not have an aperture ring. Okay, so this is a 50 millimeter autofocus Nikkor, it will work fine with this camera. And it's very important that if you have some of these older lenses that were not modified, now Nikon modified these lenses years ago to work on AI cameras, but if you try to mount one of these cameras, it's going to damage this tab here. Okay, and you'll need to send the camera in for repair. So do not use non-AI lenses. Again, the way to tell is with that second row of aperture numbers, as well as, if it has a prong, these little holes. Okay, so let's mount this lens. Okay, now on the left side of the camera we have the lens lock release. Just press it in. Turn the lens to the left. Okay, and we also have a threaded PC sync socket. Okay, if you're using a studio flash, let's say, and you don't have a remote or any flash that doesn't have a hot shoe contact, then you can just plug it in here, and it is threaded for a threaded PC sync cord. All right, I'm not going to bother too much with this right now. Okay, let's come back up to the top of the camera. Here we have a hot shoe, and with certain Nikon flashes, will give you a ready light just above the viewfinder. So when the flash is ready to fire, we'll give you that indication of a red light right at the top of your viewfinder, of your eyepiece actually. All right, so on the left side here, we have where we set our ISO, and it goes from 12 to 4000. We just lift up on this ring. Let me do this with my left hand so you can see better. Okay, I'm just going to leave it set at 400, but it goes from 4000, which is this little mark at the end past 32, all the way down to 12, to an ISO of 12. All right, so we're just going to leave it set to 400. Now, as I was saying earlier when I was trying to explain how that exposure lock works using the self-timer, there is another way to compensate for that situation where you have like a bright sky behind your subject, there's a lot of sky, and the meter may be fooled by all that light. You can do exposure compensation. So in this case, with that example, we need plus exposure compensation, okay? Because the camera meter is seeing all that bright light, and the camera is choosing a faster shutter speed. And when we got our film back, we're going to see that our subject is underexposed. So we must increase that exposure, and you could do that here. It's marked in 1/3 stop. So here's 1 stop more exposure. Here's 1 1/3, 1 2/3, and then you go as much as 2 stops of exposure compensation. You also could go down. You could also go in the opposite direction and underexpose. That could be, let's say, you're photographing a subject in front of black curtains. So now the meter thinks it's much darker than it actually is. It doesn't know your subject is a person. It sees those black curtains and is indicating too much exposure. In that case, yes, you could use the self-timer lever by holding it in, pushing it in towards the lens, or you could use this method, just come over to the exposure compensation dial, and let's say dial in -1 stop or whatever. With film, with negative film, with color negative film, or black and white film, the exposure isn't as critical as if you were using slide film. When exposure compensation is set, if you look to the right of the viewfinder, you will notice that a plus and minus is lit up in red. That's a reminder that you have set exposure compensation. Okay, so to open the back on the camera, one other very important thing on this side, we have our rewind knob. And you notice that arrow there pointing to the right. When you're going to rewind film, you would turn it in that direction. Okay, but it's also, using the rewind knob, is how you open the back on the camera. Now there's this little plastic part here, and it moves to the right. You just take your thumb, pushing it to the right, and then pull up on the rewind knob, and the back swings open. Okay? And when we look at the back, all right, we see our vertically traveling titanium honeycomb shutter. That's what gives this camera the ability to shoot at such a high flash sync speed of a 2/50th of a second. Most cameras before this one synced at maybe a 1/125th of a second, such as the Nikromats and others. But this camera syncs at that higher speed, which is great for full flash photography outdoors. Also, it gives you the capability of a 4,000th of a second shutter speed. The Nikon F2, which was introduced in 1971, had a 2,000th of a second top speed. Well, this camera did that one better and went to a 4,000th of a second. This camera also accepts a data back. That's what those two little contacts you see there. The back is removable. Just press down on this here. Back comes off and you can replace it with a data back. All right, so let's get this baby back on. All right. Also on the back is this slot here where you could put the end of a film box so you know what kind of film you have in the camera. All right, on the bottom of the camera, we're going to start on the right side. This is a connection for the motor drive. This is what actually advances the film. We have our film rewind button. And when I show you how to load the camera, I will explain this in more detail. Centered up behind the lens is the tripod socket. We have our battery compartment, and we have electronic connection for the motor drive. Now this camera will accept modern silver or lithium batteries. So that's a nice feature. Some of the older cameras did not. You had to use mercury batteries. So I'm going to show you that battery. Okay, this is one of the batteries you can use. You could use two S76 batteries, which are, I believe they're 1.5 volts each. This is a 3-volt Duracell 1/3 N lithium battery. Works fine in this camera. And to remove the battery, by the way, once you are at frame number 1, all right, remember the meter does not work before you get to frame number 1. And you don't have to have film in there to do this. You could just, with the back closed, advance to frame number 1, hold light pressure on the shutter release, and if the meter needle moves, if it moves down, it means your battery's good. All right, so the battery's in here. Okay, the plus side goes to the outside, so this battery holder, okay, just place it in, and then screw it back in. Now, I would recommend when doing this that you use a Canadian nickel because they are softer than a US nickel. And the US nickels, sometimes you will see a lot of older cameras with the slot damaged on the cover for the battery compartment. Okay, now let me explain a little bit. We talked about the meter. Let me explain a little bit about that, and I'm also going to explain the focusing screen. Okay, this camera uses a center-weighted meter. It is indicated on the focus screen by a 12mm etched circle. That is the area of greatest sensitivity for the meter. The meter concentrates about 60% of its sensitivity in that 60mm central circle. Okay, so it's important when taking pictures to make sure that that central area is over your main subject. This camera also uses silicon blue meter cells, which are superior to the CDS cells which were used in the 60s and good part of the 70s in cameras. So it's a very accurate, highly sensitive meter. One other thing I forgot to mention earlier concerning the meter is the meter is activated by you putting light pressure on the shutter release. When you remove your finger from the shutter release, the meter will stay on for 16 seconds. Now let me just explain a little something more about the hot shoe. You notice these additional contacts here, 1, 2, 3, in addition to the center one. They couple to certain Nikon flashes that permit TTL through the lens flash metering to give you very highly accurate flash exposures. Now let me just talk a little bit about the view through the viewfinder. You are seeing 93% of what will appear on the film. So when you get your film back, if you look at your negatives, you're going to see a little bit more than what you remembered when looking through the viewfinder. This camera has interchangeable focusing screens. The standard screen is the K screen, which has been a very popular Nikon screen since the early 70s with the Nikon F2. It has a split image in the center, a 3mm split image rangefinder spot in the center, surrounded by a 1mm micro prism donut, and then of course around that is the 12mm etched circle, which indicates the 60% sensitivity of the center weighted meter. Above that, you will see just off the focusing screen will give you the indication of your set aperture. And that's what those little numbers are for behind the larger numbers on your aperture ring. Okay, there's also a secondary set which all AI and AIS lenses have. Also on the left you will see all your shutter speeds, and the black needle will point to the selected shutter speed if you're in manual. And if you're in automatic, it will show you the shutter speed that the camera selects. You will also notice at the top left there a green translucent bar. When you are in manual exposure mode, it will move down when you have correct exposure and line up with the black meter needle. Where it is now in this picture, it's on A, indicating automatic exposure, and then you'll notice at the bottom it would move to either the M for the M to 50th of a second shutter speed when you don't have a battery in the camera, or B for bulb exposure, for those exposures where you would press down on the shutter release, and when you release it, the shutter would close. Okay? Now, this camera takes a total of 3 focusing screens. The K screen, which I already mentioned, it is actually called a K2 screen. The K screen was the screen for some of the earlier cameras. The K2 screen, the 2 indicates that it's a brighter screen. There's also a B2 screen and an E2 screen. The B2 screen does not have the microprism or split image rangefinder in the center. It just has a central focusing spot, and the E screen has that central focusing spot as well as etch lines to help with composition, especially useful for architectural photography. Oh, let me just show you how to change the screens. Okay, so you need to remove the lens. And the screens come with a little tool, a little pair of tweezers. And there's a little tab here. Let me try to indicate that a little better. Right there, which you pull down. You can take out the screen and replace it. Okay, very simple to do. Just don't touch the screen when you're doing that. All right, now let me show you how to load the camera. We're going to pull out the advanced lever. Okay, and first thing you want to do when you're about to load a roll of film is make sure there's no film in the camera. So how do you do that? What I usually do is just especially if you haven't used the camera for a while, it's been away, you're not sure if you left a roll in. So you just very gently turn the rewind crank in the direction of the arrow. If there's no resistance at all, that means there's no film in the camera. Okay, and next thing is to set your ISO. So we're already set for 400, so let's assume, actually I'm putting in an old roll of 100 speed film, but so I would set it for 100 if that was a good roll of film. We'll just leave it to 400. And remember, the way to do that is to lift up on this ring, and you could just turn. So there's where it would be for 100, and we're just going to put it back to 400. All right, so you're going to press back on this tab here and raise the rewind knob to open the back. And we'll put the end of the box, slide it in from the top right here so we remember what we have in the camera, what kind of film we have. So now we're just going to push up on the rewind knob. All right, you always have to use this little locking device here to push up on the rewind knob. Now we drop the roll of film in. Okay, and it's a multi-slotted take-up spool. So you're going to find a slot, and there we go. I notice it's a little hard to see. I mean, basically all cameras load the same. All film cameras pretty much load the same, except for some of the older Canons and some of the newer cameras. Okay, I'm just going to shove that in there. All right, and now we're going to advance it. And we want to make sure the sprocket holes engage with the sprocket teeth in the camera. Okay? Now, we're also going to push down our rewind knob a little and just make sure there's no slack in here, or very little slack. All right, now I leave the rewind crank unopened like that, all right? So now we're going to have to make a couple blanks. Now remember, at this point, when we're set to A, the shutter speed is at 1/250th of a second, which really doesn't matter, but the meter is not working at this point because we haven't reached frame number 1. Now notice the rewind knob as I make my blanks. You notice how it's turning? Okay? That indicates we properly loaded the film. So that was my 2 blanks. Now I'm going to go one more time, and now we are ready for frame number 1. and the meter is now active, and we could close that. If this rewind knob is not turning when you advance the film, that means that the film was not loaded properly. Open the back and try it again. Maybe you didn't slip it into the take-up spool properly, or it pulled out. So good idea to always check that. Okay, now I'm just going to show you how to unload the camera. All right, let's say you reach the end of the roll. All right, so you're going to turn the camera over. You're going to press in this rewind button. Okay, that's very important. You must press in that rewind button. Now you're going to unfold the rewind crank and turn in the direction of the arrow, and you will feel some resistance. Okay. Now I don't want to rewind this all the way into the cassette because I like to use this roll for demonstration purposes. So usually you could hear like a little click. There we go. When it pulls off the take-up spool. Then it's going to move this over, that little lever, and the camera springs open. Camera back springs open, and there we go. Just lift up on that a little bit to get it out. Okay, normally you would rewind this all the way in. I should have said this before I unloaded the camera, but it don't matter really. When you reach the end of the roll, you will know because you will try to advance film and it will stop. And it'll be really hard to move the lever any further. Do not force it, because what could happen is that by pulling really hard on this, you could pull the film completely out of the cassette. Now it's taped on at the end. That usually doesn't happen, but just don't be, look at your frame counter. If you have a 36 exposure roll, sometimes you may get 30s, 37, maybe even 38 images on a 36 exposure roll, but don't try to go any further than that, okay? When you advance it, if it stops there, just stop and pressing the button and rewind. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below or send me an email. My email address is in the comments below. I'm also going to put a link to my video on the Nikon FM, which was Nikon's first compact camera, which was introduced in 1977. So these cameras, you find them all day on eBay. Prices vary greatly. So, you want to get one to make sure the meter works, make sure in the listing it says that the meter works. A lot of these cameras, unlike some of the older ones with the CDS cells, meters usually work. Okay, so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I come out with the new video every Monday and Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you next time.